We're going to talk about the basic income, yes. I was quite interested about the precariat, as you say, that it is a class in the making.
Yep.
And at the same time it was defined as what differentiated it sort of from the lumpen proletariat was the fact that it had a relation to production and distribution. And I was thinking, actually, if you look at it from a functionality perspective, from the disability divide, which in my view is sort of just a kind of made up thing, isn't it just to say that this is a class that is made up of people who are no longer able to function on the way that the production sort of wants them to be? And is that really then somebody who has a relation to the production, or is it just a question of them being in like a transition?
No, I think what you've got to put the picture as is that globalization and all of our countries entering a global market system has created a class fragmentation. I think that's the starting point. And you know, with your plutocracy and your salariat way up in the top, earning fantastic incomes, much of it from capital, they aren't actually earning it, but they're receiving it. And then the old working class proletariat, the industrial workers, they're dwindling, they're disappearing. And the precariat is actually wanted by this new capitalist era. And they are wanted as unstable labor, okay? Providing flexible labor, and therefore having to internalize a life of unstable labor and often unstable living that goes with it, right? And therefore I think it's important to see the precariat as the emerging mass class of people in society. Now, one of the problems is that if you're in the precariat, you don't have occupational security, you don't have security in your relationships, but you are expected to have a particular relationship to the labour market, which gives you uncertainty. You're living on money wages with increasing inability to get state benefits without passing means tests and behaviour tests and all these tests that governments are devising. And you're losing rights. People are losing rights. And that's a key theme in the book, that what I talk about, denizens, is the first time in history where we've got a mass class of people losing social rights. They don't have access to benefits. Losing economic rights. They don't have the right to practice what they're skilled at doing. Losing cultural rights because they can't belong to a community. And losing civil rights, very importantly. And then finally, often losing political rights because they don't feel themselves represented in the mainstream of society. So in that context, we have a different paradigm, a different model of society that's emerging. And to go back to the old Swedish model, or to the old British welfare model, or the German Bismarckian model, you couldn't do that. And that's the problem. And we have to realize that those old models were oriented to a society where the great mass of people were in stable employment, with stable families and stable relationships. That isn't going to be the future. By 2020, in many Swedish towns and cities, a majority of people are going to be singletons, living by themselves without stable family relationships. And they're going to have to accept, whether they like it or not, regrettably, unstable labour, where one day to the next they may find themselves unemployed, earning much less than before, and so on. Now, if we allow all of this to continue, we are going to have a society in which millions and millions of people are going to be suffering from stress, from mental pressures, from burnout, from all the insecurities that go with this lifestyle. And it's about time that we, as civilized societies, started to think out of the box. Yeah. Because we're in the 21st century, not in the 20th. And the 21st century, the key point is that the distribution system of the 20th century has broken down. And what that means is that the old battle, the struggle between profits and wages, between employers and workers, has been won decisively by capital. So more and more income is going to people who are receiving capital income. And we're in a global system where the wages and benefits in Sweden of the ordinary worker are going to be under downward pressure for the next 20-30 years. That is the context. And I think we have to really be thinking of a new system of distribution in which we say, look, the work and the contribution of generations of Swedes has produced the wealth of Sweden today. But there aren't mechanisms by which we can have a fair sharing so that everybody in Sweden, everybody who's living here as citizens or as legalized residents, should have security, should have basic security. That is what a civilized society should aim at. And it is no use the Puritan work ethic being cited, because however hard people work, a large number of people are going to be earning wages that don't give them a decent standard of living. And that is the context where we have to reconsider a basic income, call it something else if you wish, but whereby every person here shares in the proceeds of the past generations who've built up the wealth of Swedes in general. And that, I think, is where the basic income debate must be rethought. And I urge everybody who... Were rethought because I think the context has changed dramatically. The context has changed where we now know that we're in a global system. Chinese workers still earn 1/40 of what any Swedish worker would, and it's going to continue. And as long as that is happening, there's going to be downward pressure on wages. It won't be because of you and I working any less. It's because capital is earning more and more, and wages are going to be under downward pressure. They have been for the past 30 years. Now, one way we can address that is say, look, if everybody has a basic income individually, a small amount, on which they could survive with dignity in extremis, then you can start redistributing to have a sense of social justice. The irony of this is that people who have basic security actually work more, not less. The standard criticism from a middle-class person is, oh, if you gave people a basic income, they'd be lazy, sit on their backside, not do anything, they would be all sitting on the beach and everything. That is wrong, wrong, wrong. Psychological research has shown that people who have basic security are more productive in their work. They work more because they have a sense of dignity. And in the current state of the Swedish social security system, it has a big additional advantage, which is it removes the poverty trap. Yeah. Sweden and other countries are all suffering from a terrible poverty trap. What this means is that if you are a person dependent on welfare, dependent on social assistance, it won't pay to take those low-wage jobs because you are paying an effective tax rate of 80% going from a benefit, which you lose, to going to a low-wage job. And that means that you have a tremendous disincentive for people in the lower ends of our labour market to take the sort of jobs that are coming. If you have a basic income, you remove the poverty trap automatically, so that everybody who takes a low-wage job is actually going to be paying the standard rate of tax. So that that is not only fairer, but it is instrumentally better because it increases the incentive to work. So you have a number of instrumental reasons besides the social justice where moving towards a basic income would promote productivity, promote work, and there are additional advantages. We know that people who have basic security as a right, are more altruistic. They tend to care more about other people. They tend to be more tolerant about other people because they feel they have some anchor in society, some floor of security. They are members of society. And then I think of certain particular groups, what I call denizens or part of the prekariat, and particular people with disabilities. People with disabilities are being subject to more and more tests to prove they are disabled, to prove they cannot do this or that or the rest of it. And this creates an atmosphere of paternalistic pity and condemnation. I've seen it in my own country, in Great Britain. Yes, with ATOS, you have these privatized systems of testing people. But we should be very careful because every country that I visit is moving in this direction. It's moving.
For example, I had to shower in front of expert. Would you call it in English arbetsterapeut? Yeah.
You have to do that.
Yeah, in front of her. So when she looked at me when I was showering and calculating the time, you know.
You see, this trend of dealing with people with disabilities is the same trend as dealing with the unemployed. Yeah, it's the same trend with dealing with maternity leave. All of these things are increasing the controls, and as such, what we're seeing is an increasing tendency to turn welfare policy into finding ways of distinguishing between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. It's very moralistic.
Yeah, it is very moralistic.
And this moralistic trend is something that is thoroughly unhealthy because it leads to condemnation, it leads to collective punishments because, you know, people who are like that are assumed to be in certain types, and it leads to feeding the media with prejudiced perspectives which then feed back on the very people. So we've seen, for example, in Great Britain, since the government has tightened up these assessment tests for determining whether disabled receive benefits, there's been a great increase in hate crime against people with disabilities. People, you know, accusing people with disabilities of inventing it or something like that is really shocking.
But I think that in Sweden it's the same. It's just less. It's a little bit subtle there. It's less brutal. It's more subtle. But then of course they talk about, you know, the cheaters, and you have to save the system and the people who really need it from the thing, and it's all done in that case. But if you would look at the basic income, for example, yes, it covers the kind of basic kind of sustenance things. But things like, for example, personal assistance or added costs, technical aids and stuff like that would still be a matter of problem for disabled people. And you open up somewhere in the book about having that as a special component, and you talk about, for example, a lesser basic income for children and stuff like that. And you know, how would that work? And how...
Well, I think it's actually would work much better than the current systems, because it won't require complex means tests, it won't require complex administrative processes. If you have a particular disability which normally involves extra costs because you've got to deal with it, then there should be a payment to enable that person. If a person is incapacitated to such an extent that he or she cannot manage their own lives, then of course additional costs and additional services should be provided. The thing is, they should be provided on the basis of the disability, not on the basis of behavioral issues outside the disability. The classic case for me, which really raises my blood pressure, is that there used to be in Britain that if you couldn't walk more than 30 meters, then you got an extra amount, right? Now, but to reduce, yes, remember, now to reduce the number of people receiving the benefits, they've reduced it to 20 meters, you see, so if you can walk. Well, now think what this does. It means that it sets up what we call a moral hazard. You would have an incentive not to be able to walk 20 meters, because otherwise you'd lose your benefit. So it creates the wrong incentives and really is punitive. Now, what I think is really critical in this whole context is here we're creating a society of massive inequalities that don't relate to the contributions of people, their positional advantages. Here we are creating a society of chronic insecurity where people are on the edge of debt in many cases. With one accident they could lose everything. And here we are creating a society where individualism is promoted at the expense of a sense of community and social solidarity. And one of the great advantages of a universal base, of a basic income, would be that it would strengthen the sense of social solidarity and strengthen the sense of social empathy. The ability to put ourselves in the position of the other person rather than just think of me, 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 me. Now, I think treating people as human beings and as full citizens in a wider sense, not in a legal sense, induces behavior by the person and by others towards that person. And I think a basic income has an incredible emancipatory promise in it. And we really should be experimenting, moving in this direction, thinking transformatively in the 21st century, and not be so moralistic and judgmental and paternalistic. Trust people. They want to improve their lives. They're not going to be lazy. They want to improve their lives, and that should be the motto that we take into the future.
It's somebody who's taking care of you, and that means also that comes with a whole paternalistic view, and it comes with an inequality that somebody has the power over you, and by the one thing that the personal assistant reform in Sweden did was enable us to get out of that. And by having our flat rate per hour, even when we had the assessment, if you had the hour, you have the hour. And then, of course, you have to set the salaries so they're even, and you have to kind of, treat people right. But if you don't treat people right, they go, Yeah,
I think the key word that you've used there, which I think is the heart of the problem, is to escape from paternalism. This sense of you should be grateful, and we're only doing this because we must help you, and then you've got to be polite and everything simply because you're in a dependent situation. That is wrong, and the long-term strategy must be to increase the rights of people, increasing their rights to have what assistance or help or care what they need, and to be able to make choices, and all sides to be able to make choices. And unless you have realistic alternatives from which to make a choice, and people to assist you make those choices, then I think your paternalism is going to become more and more segregational in its character.
Because I think that's one of the things you need. Maybe for us would be there would be two things that basic income would have to be attached to in a way, and it would be the fact that it can't be an excuse to say, but you have basic income, so we don't need to organize or design society so that you also can be a part of the main, or the common, even if that is labor or part of the culture or scene or whatever. It can't be used as an excuse for not opening up the rest, because that is the right to space and time in a way. And it also the fact that if there is the part that if you need this kind of personal assistance to kind of actually being able to use those things, to get out in them and stuff like that, that has to provide it in with the same kind of features as the basic incomes does, which means basically cash-based. Basically you take it and you will have to use it yourself. It's not something provided in kind by somebody else, because that is the same, for me at least, it's the same. Without that, basic income doesn't mean anything for me. And I think that most people would agree.
I put it this way in the Charter. I say there are two meta needs, fundamental needs. One is that everybody should have basic security, okay? And the second thing, which is equally vital, not more or less, is basic voice, representation. Because unless you have the capacity to act in concert, as a group, whatever your particular group, then you're going to be vulnerable to being segregated in some sense by the state and by institutions in the state. And I think the necessity of having a collective voice actually strengthens individual freedom as well. Because whatever policies we propose should be emancipatory for everybody, for whoever is at the end, whether it's a migrant, whether it's someone with a disability, whether it's a child, or whether it's an elderly person. We should judge that policy by whether it increases the sense of freedom of that individual. I would like to end my comments in this discussion by saying that the 2 points you've made, which I think are really important. One is that we need to think about having a sense of control over our time. Our time. We need a politics of time. We're all under intense pressure. This is part of the precariatized mind that I talk about in the books. And the other thing is that we need to recover our sense of the commons, strengthen the commons, which is a fundamental issue for every single person in society. We have seen a terrible erosion of the commons, the social commons, the physical. We're sitting in a beautiful park in Stockholm, and behind this fantastic library, which is part of the Swedish commons. Now, heaven help Sweden if any of these things were to be lost. But if you look around with the commodification of globalization, you're seeing an erosion taking place, even in places that 10 years ago people said, we'll never lose that park. Go to Istanbul now, for example. So we need a multi-pronged approach. And this is important for every group, including everybody with a disability, to have access to the public space, to the commons, is vital. Now, I genuinely believe that people who have basic security tend to be much more altruistic and politically oriented to preserving society. And that means...
You would have more time to think about it. Exactly. You could afford to actually think about it if you have basic security. I mean, it takes basic security to actually be able to take the risk of democracy in a way, I would say. But
insecurity promotes the extremism that we're seeing in so many elections, and neo-fascism is the outcome of chronic insecurity. Unless we have serious policies to promote universal basic security, that neo-fascist tendency will continue to grow. It's really a major worry across Europe, and it's beginning to affect places that 10 years ago no one would have dreamt of a return to some sort of neo-fascist extremism. You're seeing it today, And unless we really rethink our social protection system, we're going to see that grow further, and it's going to be a major worry. But I'm confident, actually, that a country as civilized and as, you know, that's been such a harbinger of social reform as Sweden will be able to reconstruct a model of society which is all-embracive and strengthens social security. And I think basic income is one component of that reconfiguration.